Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is one of Canada's busiest, most talented, most versatile musicians. If you've ever been to a major production in St. John's with live music, you've probably seen his name. If you don't recognize him, you've no doubt seen his name. And his latest CD is called Kaleidoscope, and it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Bill Brennan to the program.
Thank you very much.
Do you say CDs now, or albums, or recordings? I don't know.
I'm pressing some CDs, so album is probably the best used word these days, because some people aren't pressing CDs; they're just going direct to digital. So.
Yeah, there's so many different options now.
There are.
You know?
Yeah.
And of course, vinyl seems to be making a bit of a comeback in a way, because I see record players in stores and in catalogs and what have you.
It is true, actually. Vinyl is it sells for certain genres and for certain albums better than CD. So I'm told by my friend who works down at Fred's. So I'm considering that for a pressing in the future.
The thing about albums too is that you get the beautiful artwork. Which is not such emphasized as much with CDs, and of course, if you're just doing, you know, MP3s or whatever they call them, you know, there wouldn't be any artwork.
And it's on the 12-inch disc, so you can read it better when you're somebody like my age.
Exactly.
Right. So.
Yeah, that's right. Bill, you know, for someone such as yourself. I don't think that you having musical talent was an accident, because you come from a musical family, don't you? Talk about your family.
Yeah, I do. My mom and dad were very musical, though not performers as such. Though my dad, in some ways, was a bit of a performer in his earlier years when he was involved with the Scouts. The Scouts were the first St. John's Boy Scout troop. Every year in the 50s and 60s had an event in the spring called Springs, Smiles and Whistles. And he was one of the premier performers on that show. It was, you know, they're all benefit type shows. But he was a soloist and loved music, and he was the sing-song leader for his Boy Scout troop, and he was often called upon to be a host at, or an MC for a show, and he would sing some songs. And he had a terrific voice, he really did. It was quite phenomenal, his singing, right up until his latter years. And my mom played piano a little tiny bit, but they loved music. And my mom's brother, Davy Owens, had a group in town, and they used to play at the bass. This is last going off, he had a trio with Mary Shea, and some of your guests may remember the name Chinny Howell, who was a drummer. And he played shows at the bass for years and years and years, and my mom's aunt, who was actually more like a sister because they were quite close in age. Her name was Bridie Burke. She married a Maloney, Bridie Maloney. She would play at the bass for dances in the 40s and 50s until she went away to New York. And then when she came back to St. John's, my mom and dad had gotten us all into, started with my brother Frank, who's the eldest, into music lessons. So he took clarinet and piano. The next eldest were my twin sisters, Anne and Elizabeth. Anne played trumpet, Elizabeth played trumpet, and they both played piano. My sister Eleanor played clarinet, and she took piano lessons. I took piano lessons. My sister Tina took piano lessons, played clarinet. My sister Mary played flute and clarinet, flute and piano. But Mom and Dad had us in lessons from when we were probably 7 or 8 years old. I studied with Carla Furlong, actually, for quite a number of years, as well as with my aunt. So music was in the house all day long, as you can imagine, with seven of us sort of battling out for time on the piano or practicing our instruments. And I was really into rhythm right from a very early age. Like, I would get into the kitchen, I'd take out the apple juice cans and the corn on the cob in the can and the small cans of tomato sauce, and I would make a little drum set on the kitchen floor, and I'd play with forks and knives, and Mom and Dad thought, God, we better get him into drums, you know? But it really was a house filled with music, and we actually started a family music group that would do benefit concerts. And sometimes we'd go into an old folks home and play a concert. But that was spurred on by my aunt, who came back from New York and started us doing vocal arrangements of things like the Swingle Singers, if you remember that group. I think
Yes,
they still exist, actually,
yeah.
but obviously the membership have changed over the years. So yeah, my that love of music and dancing and rhythm was passed down from my mom and from my dad and from my aunt and my uncle.
So what about your formal education? Did you go to music school?
So yeah, when I did, prior to that, you know, with the juice cans and the tomato sauce cans, mom and dad thinking, as I said, you know, we should get him into some percussion lessons. They got me enrolled in the MUN Preparatory School, which doesn't exist now, but it was a school whereby I think many of the professors at MUN would teach on Saturday mornings over at where I took my lessons was actually in the basement of the little theater in the Arts and Administration building with Don Wary. And Don Wary, for your listeners, was a force in the music scene, especially in St. John's, but in the province. He came here in the early 70s after having quite a career in Toronto with the Toronto Symphony and also playing in Hamilton, but kind of wanted to get away from the big city and explore sound in a different way than he was doing there in terms of orchestral music and commercial music. So he was really interested in the philosophy of sound. And he moved out to Torres Cove in the early 70s, and Don Cook, who was the director of the School of Music, got him involved in the school preparatory program. And so I took lessons from Don for years, starting in grade 8. And you know, I took 4 years of lessons from him. I was grade 11. What am I going to do? All I can think of is going to music school. That's all I really wanted to do. So I did go to MUN for a year, and I was the only percussion student. The percussion was my major. I was the only percussion student there. And Don was amazing. He said, you know, you really need to go somewhere else where there are other students like yourself, and you can learn from them and from other teachers. So I went to the University of Toronto and got my Bachelor's of Music there, studying with the great Russell Hartenberger, who's founding member of the percussion group Nexus. So formal training indeed through MUN and through U of T.
And but you're a keyboardist. Was that part of the percussion training as well, or?
That's a good question, because it is a percussion instrument, because you hit
people
keys.
Play the xylophone and whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a pitched. In the percussion family, we have pitched musical instruments like you just referenced: the xylophone, the marimba, the glockenspiel.
Right. Yeah.
And those are keyboard percussion instruments. But part of the reason why they call it percussion is because you use hammers or mallets to hit the instrument. With the piano, you depress a key, but that makes a hammer come up and hit a string. So it is a percussion instrument. But I would say most percussionists don't play piano. But I took lessons first with my aunt, Bridie, like I mentioned, and then with Karl Furlong. And piano never really went by the wayside. It was piano for me. I was never really a particularly technical player. I wasn't a very good classical pianist. But I spent my time in the basement as a kid looking through my aunt's fake books, you know, fake books of tunes from the 50s and 60s and 70s, and the Gershwin songbook and the Cole Porter songbooks. And I would look at them, at the notes, and they would have chord changes on top of the staff. I'm like, oh, so that's a C. Oh, that's a C chord. C minor. Oh, it has an E flat in it. Okay, now I know what a minor chord is. And I kind of learned a lot on my own from these fake books. And when I went to school in Toronto, I majored in percussion, but I kept playing piano. We had a piano in the percussion studio, and then my friend Mark, who was a pretty decent jazz vibes player, we would jam. And there were other percussionists who maybe someone might play drum set, and we'd have a bass player come in, and we'd learn these old jazz standards on our own. But I never learned anything really jazz-wise through lessons until probably 4 years after university. I thought, you know, I love this world of jazz piano, and we may talk about that a little bit more, but I thought I should take some lessons. So I started taking lessons from a guy named Brian Rudolph in Toronto, and actually one lesson from a really amazing piano player named Frank Falco. And I learned a little bit more about the tradition and about scales and what type of scales work over what type of chords, and so I learned a little bit more about jazz harmony and jazz theory. And I was able to apply that to my own music. And I was kind of getting pretty good at it. And then I got asked to do a show, a gig with some friends of mine where we were doing all Earth, Wind, and Fire tunes and Stevie Wonder tunes. And that was sort of my bag. I really liked that. I'm like, geez, I'm getting pretty good at this, and people are starting to call me to do gigs, so I should be a bit more serious about my piano playing. So I took some more lessons, and all of a sudden, sort of in the mid-90s, and I realized that I was actually working half-time as a percussionist, as a gigging percussionist, and half-time as a gigging pianist. So it served me well all that time in the basement as a kid, you know. Lots of time on my own, just learning how to play, learning what the music is about. You know? How
did you actually begin your professional career?
So U of T was an amazing school for percussion. Like I mentioned, Russell Hartenberger taught there. Robin Engelman, also a member of Nexus, taught there. A former member a member of Nexus who used to teach at U of T, John Wire, who then moved to St. John's, was still in Toronto. One or two of the other members of the group were in Toronto. So it was a percussion mecca. And it still is. With Russell teaching there, and with him having such an extensive performing career, not just with Nexus, but as an extra musician with various high-level music groups in Toronto and commercial work, he sometimes wasn't able to do a gig because he was too busy. And oftentimes he would call on his students, or he would suggest his students for work. So in many ways, that's how I got into playing professionally in Toronto, is because of his expertise as a teacher, but his influence in the community as well. So many of his students, 4 or 5 of his students, started playing with an ensemble called the Evergreen Club Gamelan Ensemble. And I started playing with that group. Somebody noticed me playing with that group and said, hey, I really like the way you play. Do you want to do this concert with the North York Symphony Orchestra, say, for instance, you know, regional orchestras? And I kind of worked my way up through the minor leagues, as it were, of music in Toronto.
So there you were in Toronto. Obviously, you know, Canada is a place where you've performed, but you've also performed throughout Europe and beyond over the years. Dozen or so countries, I guess. What are some of the fondest memories you have of all of those experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question, because they're all so unique. You know, like the cultures of our globe are fascinating. I think one of the places that I first went to that made an incredible impression on me was Japan. I went over there with a large group of percussionists to perform with a Japanese marimba player named Mika Yoshida. And I think just from the moment I landed there, it was a culture that I wasn't ready for. I've been to Ghana, I've been to Brazil, and I did the research. You know, I found out a little bit about the country, what it was going to be like, and you know, you do your research to find out where you should, what the food was going to be like, what the music's going to be like. And I didn't really do that for Japan, because I was kind of being taken care of. You know, all the hotels were organized, all the meals were organized. I didn't really have to worry about any of that. So in some ways, I just wasn't ready for that culture shock, and it really was very, very different culture. A culture of incredible respect for one another. Like, so for instance, I remember being on the streetcar, and it was the streetcar driver's when we got to the last stop of the streetcar driver, they were going to change drivers. He got up and he stood and he bowed to everybody on the streetcar. And I'm like, wow, that's quite something. So that respect was really really made me think about how I should lead my life, you know, respect for others. I'd never had sushi before. That was incredible, blew my mind. I had the best orange of my life there. We were talking about oranges earlier for breakfast before we started recording. It was just, the food was amazing. The audiences were incredibly enthusiastic. Getting back to respect, I remember getting on a domestic flight in Japan, and the flight was supposed to leave at 8:30, and it was 25 after 8, and we still hadn't boarded yet. And I thought, what's on the go? This is strange. And I thought, we'll never get off on time. Well, we boarded. It was like clockwork. It was amazing how fast everybody just respected one another, and we got on, and we were left on time. So it was really quite phenomenal, and also Japanese music and dance, which I got to experience while over there, was something that I'd never really experienced before. The very slow moving dance style of traditional Japanese dance really blew my mind. I think that with one of the other experiences that I had was I had a duo with a dancer named Sarah Chase, an amazing dancer originally from the West Coast. Moved to Toronto, and we performed together in a dance theater show, and realized how much we enjoyed one another's company, and she asked me to be her musical director, performer, for some touring that she was doing in Belgium and in Germany. And storytelling was a big part of her original work. And one of the projects that we did was to go into 4 people's homes in Germany. This happened in 4 different places in Germany, in Bonn, in Duisburg, in Dusseldorf, and the other place, and in Cologne, or Köln. And we went into a person's home. They allowed us in their home without them being there to research their life through what they had in their home, through photo albums, through pictures, through their music, through family photographs, and we made a story about their life as we saw it. And it was really quite beautiful getting to know these people, just regular people. One of them was a survivor of a war camp, of a Nazi camp in Germany, and it was really quite. It was life-changing, really. Yeah.
Bill, you were, I had no idea that this was the case, but you were the music director for CBC Radio's Vinyl Cafe with Stuart McLean.
I was.
How did that happen, and what was that experience like?
You know, so often in my life, I've been in the right place at the right time, or I've met the right person at the right time. And through a friend of mine, Andrea Koziel, and she's a longtime collaborator of mine, I got to know a friend of hers named Annie McNeil. And Andy was the librarian, one of the librarians at the CBC Library in Toronto, downtown. So for these shows, like the Vinyl Cafe and Morningside and other shows such as that, they often need music for the ends of a program, as music to go out into the news. Now the Vinyl Cafe is of course different, because some of the Vinyl Cafe shows were filmed in front of a live audience, but some weren't. So the producer of the show, when I say some weren't, meaning Stuart would record some songs, and then the producer chose music to go along with that week's show. Might have to do with the theme of his stories. So the producer of the show's name was David Amer. And David got to know Andy McNeil quite well, because Andy was the CBC librarian. He'd go to Andy and say, Andy, I need this piece of music by Joe Cocker. Great. Andy would go and get the LP or the CD. This was prior to MP3s. And they became friends. I was a friend of Andy. So David came to Andy one time and said, Andy, I'm looking for somebody, a musical director for Stewart's Christmas show this year. This was the year after the famous Christmas concert where Stewart told the story about not being able to cook the turkey at home, and he had to go to the Four Seasons or something like that to cook the turkey, and it was a hilarious story. So that following year, the Vinyl Cafe Christmas show was a hot ticket, and it sold out in about 5 minutes. I had been, because I knew Andy, David called me up and said, I hear you're a great musician. We're going to be doing another CBC Christmas show with Stuart McLean. Would you be interested in being the musical director? I'm like, yes, of course. And David and I got together in October, and we discussed what the stories might be about and what songs might work really well to fill out this program. And he said, who would you like to have on the program with you? I got to choose the band. And I got to write all the musical arrangements for these, and they were all friends of mine, for these musicians. And it was a fall of intense joy with being able to make arrangements of very well-known Christmas carols and songs for this band of bass, drums, saxophone, trumpet, violin, 3 backup singers, and myself. And it was just an incredible experience. It went over so well. All the high brass of the CBC were at the concert. And what that did is, because it went so well, David said, hey, do you want to do the next one? We're going to be doing a Valentine's Day show. So I was able to do that Valentine's Day show, and then he said, that went super well, also recorded at the Glen Gould studio in Toronto. And he said, we're doing a show out in, it was somewhere in around Stratford. I can't even remember where it was, but it was out in a field, outdoors. Would you like to be MD on that show, musical director on that show? So it started a beautiful connection with both Stuart and David.
And subsequently, you had your dad on one of the shows, and he sang Among My Souvenirs.
That's right.
That must have been fun.
It was really fun. So my wife and I decided to move here in 2002. And that fall, Stuart was doing a tour across Canada, and he was coming to St. John's. So David, once again, called me up and said, would you like to be MD on the musical director for this show? It might have been in 2003. And so Stuart and David came down. We had chosen the band, chosen the performers, and chosen all the songs. I had carte blanche. It was really quite the amazing gig. And David and I were having lunch after the day before our first concert. We did do 2 concerts. And actually, we did 1 concert, but we made 2 shows out of the 1 concert. David was just asking me about my family, and I said, the real musician in my family is my dad. And he said, well, how so? And I told him, his experiences with Spring Smiles and Whistles, and I never mentioned this, but my dad knew, except for Mark Fewer's dad, Mark the great violinist, who's a really good friend of mine, my dad knows more songs than anybody, knew more songs than anybody that I ever met in my life. And I told him about his performing history, and David said, do you think he'd sing on the show? And I said, I don't think so. I said, Dad was 70, he was in his 70s at the time. I said, I don't think, he's a bit shy now. He says, would you ask him? I said, okay. So I went over to Dad's house and I said, Dad, you can say no, but I'd really like for you to do this. We want you to sing on the Stuart McLean show tomorrow night. And he said, oh, I don't know about that, Bill. I said, I want you to sing Among My Souvenirs, which is a song that he'd sung at family parties forever.
Oh.
Forever. It was one of his signature tunes.
His party piece.
It was his party piece. And I said, why don't you come to the sound check tomorrow afternoon, see how it feels? And he said, all right, I'll do it for you. And he came to the sound check. It went pretty well, and he agreed to do it. The only people in my family who knew this was going to happen was my mom. My sister Eleanor was in the front row. She and her husband Jeff had front row tickets. And Stuart gave this elaborate introduction, saying, talking about Dad, and saying, you know, we asked Bill to ask his dad to play and sing, and he said, I don't think so, Bill, but you know what? I asked him, you know, would he do it for $1 million? And Dad said, I wouldn't do it for $1 million, but I'll do it for my son. And ladies and gentlemen, Frank Brennan, and he walked on stage with this cane, and my sister Eleanor looked at her in the audience, and her face went, I never saw a mouth drop quite like that. He sung Among My Souvenirs, and of course, the Arts and Culture Center was completely sold out, so it was a 1,000-seat theater. He finished his last note, and 1,000, I don't know, I've never experienced this, 1,000 people just went, wow! They stood up right away, all of them right away. It wasn't like dribs and drabs. It was 1,000 people, yay! And the ovation was amazing. It was the most incredible thing I've ever experienced. It was phenomenal.
That's a great, great story to end on. Bill, thanks so much for being on the program. It went like that.
I did.
Yeah.
Oh my God, there's way more to talk about. Have me back another time.
Yeah, we will, yeah. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Bill Brennan, ladies and gentlemen, and that's it for this edition of Karl Wells Point to Point. See you again next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Money Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for